Well, thanks everybody. Good afternoon. And I want to begin with a big thank you to Joe Mulholland here for inviting me to take part in this MacGill summer school. When I was on the way here, I changed some money, and I was reflecting with some of the comments about the value of the currency, that none of the Brexiteers told us it would mean us joining the euro, but just keeping the pound sign in front of the money when we did it. But that seems to be the effect if you go into the bank up the street. So we're on the edge of a big week in UK politics. In a couple of days' time, we will have a new Prime Minister, and in all likelihood, it will be the candidate who said that Brexit must happen by the 31st of October, come what may, deal or no deal. And if the result turns out as we do expect, this week will be the beginning of the testing, possibly to destruction, of the proposition that the only problem with Brexit has been a lack of belief in the project, and that all we need is a healthy dose of optimism and more belief. Now, the stakes, of course, for the UK and Ireland are very high. So high, indeed, that I believe that the unity of the UK itself could be on the line. And I've been coming, as Bobby said, to this part of Ireland all my life. My parents were born not too far from here, and they joined thousands of others in the post-war wave of emigration from Ireland. They settled in Scotland. My dad worked on the building sites there, and my mum in a local authority children's home. They could have gone to America, and that issue was discussed, because at that time the question for many young Irish people of their generation, sadly, was not if you would leave, but where you would go. They picked Scotland instead, and on that spin of the coin, I'm speaking to you today with a Glasgow accent rather than a Brooklyn one. But if you go to Brooklyn, you will find McFaddens there too. And when we were growing up, we did enjoy books by Patrick MacGill, because we were fascinated by the idea of someone from Donegal writing about the kind of working life. I mean, he wrote before my father's time, but the kind of working life that Irish workers in Scotland, like my father and men of his generation, had experienced. So I want to place my comments, in a way, in a broader context today. The title of the conference is "Can the Centre Hold?" And Yeats's words have been much referred to in the last couple of years as his prophetic poem from 100 years ago has seemed more meaningful than it has for a long time. But maybe a sharper question is not, can the centre hold, but can the centre fight back? Or in my case, can the centre left fight back against the mainly right-wing populism that has been winning elections and reshaping politics around the world? Because, as Ronan rightly identified, the populism that we're dealing with is not just a matter of Brexit, but has been seen in a number of countries around the world. And what are its key characteristics? It claims to speak for the people as a whole against the establishment. It claims that the establishment has more in common with one another than they do with the people. Advancing the people's cause confers an authenticity on its leaders as the voice of the forgotten, no matter how wealthy they are as private individuals or how right-wing the politics. And that sense of authenticity gives huge loyalty and forgiveness on the part of the followers. Not for nothing did Donald Trump say, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters." It despises compromise and trade-offs. And the old question, which I was brought up with politically, of how are you going to pay for those policies, is barely asked anymore in this kind of politics. It also denigrates institutions. We had reference to experts. In our politics in recent time, judges have been termed enemies of the people, MPs have been called traitors, and the civil service is regarded as suspect because it's not full of true believers. There is also in this a heavy dose of nostalgia. There's a lot of looking back. Look at the slogans that have been most powerful in recent years. Take our country back. Take back control. Make America great again. Back again. Back again. And the fuel, constantly topped up, is a sense of betrayal. Now, in the face of all this, both the centre-left and the centre-right have struggled to respond with a vision of the future that can capture voters' imagination. So what should we do? How should we respond? I believe we have to answer the grievances of working-class voters while resisting the temptation to reinforce myths or peddle dishonest arguments in return for a quiet life. And I want to talk to you for a minute about the background to the Brexit vote, because I understand that through Irish eyes, this can often be looked on with a sense of bemusement. Why would you want to do this? Why would you want to withdraw from the EU? Brexit is in part, though only in part, rooted in how economic change affected different parts of the UK. And again, we see the same phenomenon in different parts of the world. Overall, the UK was a winner from globalisation. Our language, our creativity, our cultural reach, our place in the single market, all of these things helped us attract talented people and investment from all over the world. But the economic impact of this was unevenly spread. While our capital city and other major metropolitan areas thrived, some other parts of the country felt left out of this story. Indeed, some of them felt hurt by this story. In areas like my Wolverhampton constituency in the West Midlands, there's a strong sense of loss about the industrial past and a sense of pride and purpose that went with it. Big industrial names that often employed 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people on one site. They all closed, most of them, a generation ago. And those closures in that economic period has left a lasting economic legacy with higher than average unemployment, long-term health problems, lower than average incomes. And then you add to that steep cuts in public spending in the last 10 years that have degraded the quality of life for communities that were already suffering economically. And the same story is true of many working class communities elsewhere in the UK. But here is also a warning, and one that was spelled out to us in a beautiful speech last night by the German ambassador, and that is not to take too rose-tinted a view of the past, because many of the social changes of the last 30 or 40 years have of course been for the better. And which young woman today would swap her life chances and choices for those of her grandmother? Not very many. So I don't take a rose-tinted view of the past, but I do say that nostalgia can sing a very seductive song. And there is no doubt that many parts of the UK have found themselves at the sharp end of economic change. And Brexit provided a perfect outlet for that sense of loss. Take back control and answer to the economic pain. And alongside this was growing opposition to the free movement of people within the EU. A view that with the enlargement to 28 member states and net migration running at around 300,000 per year, people wanted it to slow down, and in some cases they wanted it to stop. Now, all the way through, for the last 20, 30 years, more migration to the UK came from outside the EU with a system of visas and work permits and paperwork and so on, than from inside. But Brexit still provided a mechanism for people to express their opposition to the levels of migration taking place. And no honest account of the vote is complete without saying that. And pro-Europeans, we took too much for granted in the years prior to the referendum. Not really believing that we would leave, too little was made of the large degree of UK success and influence in the EU. It was easier to give credence to stories from Brussels that bureaucrats were pushing us around, with almost no attention given to the enormous advantages that single market membership gave us, or the fact that many of those European regulations had a large degree of British influence on them in the first place, something that we have learned over and over again, more since the vote, from one sector after another. So, representing a community that voted leave in the majority, I do understand the sense of loss and anger in many working class communities, because after all, everybody wants a better life. But the critical point that I make, which cannot be overemphasized, is that no one in Brussels ever stopped the UK from responding to industrial change. No one in the EU stopped us building enough houses. No one stopped us equipping people with the new skills that they would need for a new labour market, or putting in transport links, or doing anything you need to do to help areas hit hard by economic change. And just as the EU was not responsible for these issues, so leaving it will do nothing to address them. In fact, it will make them harder. So for that to happen, for the centre not only to hold, but to do something more, we need to offer people a better answer than Brexit. Last week I proposed one element of such a plan with a new fund of £4.5 billion a year, roughly equal to the net economic benefit from EU migration, and paid for not by any new tax rises, but simply by forgoing planned cuts in corporation tax, which would be targeted at smaller towns and cities over a 10-year period. It could pay for things like new training opportunities, new housing, new transport links, the things that a community needs for a better life. In short, we have to give people a chance and not just a grievance. So the question is, not just can the centre hold, but for the centre-left that I am part of, can it fight back and deliver? And can it offer real answers rather than the pretense that Brexit would provide an answer to problems that were never rooted in our membership of the EU in the first place? Now, for all the different formulations of how Brexit might be done, it comes down to an essential choice. Do you have a Brexit where the UK leaves the political structures of the EU but remains part of the economic system, of course begging the question, what's the point? Or do you have a Brexit which emphasises sovereignty above all else, is prepared to incur any economic damage, which of course begs the question, what's the price? So take all the different versions, soft Brexit, hard Brexit, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, Chequers, they all come down to that essential choice between what's the point and what's the price. Now, the outcome of the Conservative leadership this week looks like it will provide an answer to that choice. It looks like we will move in the direction of a harder Brexit, at best a Canada-type free trade deal, or possibly even a no-deal exit. And if you want a barometer of our politics right now, just look at the normalisation of a no-deal Brexit. This is an outcome which the government has estimated would produce a hit of between 5 and 10% on GDP over the medium term. In the northeast of England, the estimate is a 16% reduction. In my region, the West Midlands, a reduction of 13% relative to staying in the EU over a 15-year period. Our independent Office for Budget Responsibility just the other day talked about this leading to a £30 billion a year hit to the public finances. Ivan Rogers, the former UK ambassador to the EU, has warned of, and I quote, disruption of a scale and of a length that no one has experienced in the developed world in the past couple of generations. So why aren't these economic warnings having more impact? Well, as we've discussed, populism's method is to dismiss warnings from government, from the Bank of England, or from any institution. All that's needed, we are told, is belief and optimism. Boris Johnson describes the cost of no deal as, I quote, vanishingly inexpensive, as long as you prepare. Be a happy warrior and all will be well. But this, of course, is not a game. I serve on the House of Commons Brexit Select Committee. And week after week, we get warnings about the impact of leaving without a deal. Our main manufacturing organisation described it as economic vandalism. The farmers' representative called it disastrous. Similar warnings from the automotive sector, other sectors. The hardening towards a no-deal Brexit is leading us to run enormous risks with people's jobs and people's livelihoods. Talking it up is one thing. Delivering it is another. Last week, Parliament passed an important amendment to ensure that the new Prime Minister cannot simply bypass the Commons in going for a no-deal exit. But we are also aware that this is a struggle where the legal default position remains a no deal unless there is an extension or a deal or some other outcome. A skeptic might say, the plan is not to talk up no deal in order to go for it, but instead to make more palatable a Canada-style free trade agreement, which itself would have major implications for our market access, for our service industries, and for anything dependent on multinational supply chains. So that's the economics. But what about Northern Ireland in all of this? What about its position as the only part of the UK sharing a land border with the EU? What about the UK's commitment, our commitment, no one imposed it on us, that there should be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland? Where does all that fit in this discussion of supply chains and GDP and so on? Brexit is about more than economics, just as the EU has always been about more than economics. The EU, as we were reminded last night, was born as a peace project, with economic integration as the means to ensure that the carnage of the 20th century in Europe could not be repeated. And in that task, it has been enormously successful. And over time, it's become more integrated and emerged as one of the key economic players of the 21st century, alongside China and the United States. Now, leaving this organization would have been a challenging task for any unitary state which had been a member for over 40 years. But for a state made up of 4 constituent parts, 2 of whom disagree with the decision, it represents unique challenges. And here we come to the question not only of economics, but of identity too. The Good Friday Agreement is one of the proudest achievements of the Labour government of which I was a part. We weren't solely responsible for it, but we played a big part in it. And for decades, politics in Northern Ireland had revolved around the competing identities of the community there, where a victory for one meant a loss for the other. The agreement deliberately rejected that binary choice. It was, if you will, an agreement to disagree, to have structures which reflected, as the agreement says, that people in Northern Ireland can choose to be British or Irish or both. The border, no longer a physical barrier, but instead a legal and constitutional border. Still separate jurisdictions, but as fellow members of the EU, significant commonality in rules and regulations on both sides of the border. And of course, 40 years of European Council meetings did help to normalise relations between the two countries. In relation to the economic and social questions, which are, have a big EU focus and are often discussed at the EU Council, we found that more often than not, we had similar instincts and sought similar outcomes. So, no physical border structures, a new normality, thousands of people crossing and recrossing every day, everything that we've learned about the supply chains and agri-food business and so on. I don't have to tell anybody in this room how valuable all that is. The overlapping identities of being British or Irish or both had found an accommodation. But then comes Brexit, fueled by nationalism. And in the words of the Canadian writer Michael Ignatieff, the tyranny of nationalism is that it forces people to choose. And in a state built upon overlapping identities, forcing people to choose one identity at the expense of others, at the very least brings strain, and at the worst can set things back. In Northern Ireland, the risk is that the process of Brexit upsets that delicate settlement of allowing people to be British or Irish or both. So this isn't just about goods crossing the border, vital as though that is. It is also about identity too. And in Scotland, where the referendum in 2014 should have settled the issue for the foreseeable future, Brexit is already leading to renewed calls for independence. So take back control begs another, perhaps more fundamental question. To what will you be taking back control? Will it be the UK as we know it today, or will that be put under such strain that we cannot be sure it will continue in its present form? It would be constitutionally reckless for the new Prime Minister to think that he can pursue whatever form of Brexit he wants with no risks to the unity of the UK. So we do stand on the threshold of a momentous week. And we'll hear a lot of comment this week that Brexit will now be fine because finally it's in the hands of the true believers. But the difficulties of this project do not lie in a betrayal by those who have been trying to negotiate it so far, or in the unreasonable nature of those on the other side of the table. They lie in the choices posed by the project itself. And no matter who is in charge, they will encounter the same realities about the consequences of leaving. They will encounter the same parliamentary arithmetic, and the implications for politics, for the economy, and the Constitution will be played out. So I didn't bring the crystal ball that was referred to at the beginning of the session. And I can't predict to you whether in October we will be in a situation where there is an agreement, whether we leave with no deal in place, whether there will be an election, or whether, as many MPs across the political parties would argue, there should be a referendum, not as a rerun of 2016, but as a mechanism for putting the choice of what Brexit actually looks like in an agreed version to the people to endorse or reject, with Remain as an option. I don't know which of these options will happen, but we all know how big the stakes are. And for my part, as somebody who, as has been said, holds this part of Ireland very dear to my heart, I do hope that however it comes out, that the warm relations that we've enjoyed, particularly in recent years as neighbours, survive the process. Thank you very much.